Study Session 5, Confounding Variables, Introduction. In this study session, you will examine confounding variables. These variables are also referred to as extraneous variables. In addition, the sources of these extraneous variables shall be explained for your comprehension. At the end of this study session, you should be able to 1. Point out extraneous variables. 2. Highlight sources of confounding variables in research. Extraneous variables. The presence of an extraneous variable that is systematically related to the independent variable might differentially affect the dependent variable values of the groups in the investigation. Whenever two or more variables combine in such a way that their effects cannot be separated, a confounding of those variables has occurred. Confounding, although always a matter of concern, does not necessarily present a serious threat to internal validity. Internal validity is the extent to which a study evaluates the intended hypothesis. Confounding is less problematic when the confounding variable is known to have little or no effect on the dependent or criterion variable, or when its known effect can be taken into account in the analysis. Confounding variables is a variable that systematically varies along with the independent variable. For example, measuring an individual's cognitive intelligence without considering his or her age as a confounding variable. However, a study may include confounding and still maintain a fair degree of internal validity if the effects of the confounding variable in the situation under scrutiny are known. This is fortunate because it is often impossible to eliminate all sources of confounding by having, for example, students randomly assigned to two sections meeting simultaneously. This will certainly eliminate those sources of confounding related to any difference in the time at which the sections meet. But now, it will be impossible for the teacher to teach both classes. If a second teacher is recruited to teach one of the sections using the standard method, this introduces a new source of confounding, in that the two teachers may not be equivalent in a number of ways that could affect class performance. This explains a study investigating performances of students. Often, the best that can be done is to substitute what you believe to be less serious threats to internal validity for the more serious ones. Source of confounding. Confounding variables or extraneous variables occur in both experimental and correlational designs, but they are far more likely to be a problem in the latter, in which tight control over extraneous variables is usually lacking. Campbell and Stanley, 1963, identified 7 general sources of confounding that may affect internal validity. Number 1, history. History may confound studies in which multiple observations are taken over time. Specific events may occur between observations that affect the results. For example, a study of the effectiveness of an advertising campaign against drunk driving might measure the number of arrests for drunk driving. This event will destroy the internal validity of your study. 2. Maturation. Maturation refers to the effect of age or fatigue. Performance changes observed over time due to these factors may confound those due to the variables being studied. You might, for example, assess performance on a proofreading task before and after some experimental manipulation. Decreased performance on the second proofreading assessment may be due to fatigue rather than to any effect on your manipulation. 3. Testing effects. Testing effects occur when a pretest sensitizes participants to what you are investigating in your study. As a consequence, they may respond differently on a post-treatment measure than if no pretest were given. For example, if you measure participants' racial attitudes and then manipulate race in an experiment on person perception, participants may respond to the treatment differently that if no such pretest of racial attitudes was not given. 4. Instrumentation. Here, confounding may be introduced by other unobserved changes in criteria used by observers. If observers change what counts as verbal aggression when scoring behavior under 2 experimental conditions, any apparent difference between those conditions in verbal aggression could be due as much to the changed criterion to any effect of the independent variable. Similarly, if an instrument used to record activity of rats in a cage becomes less or less sensitive over time, it becomes impossible to tell whether activity really changing or just the ability of the instrument to detect ability. Statistical regression. 5. This threatens internal validity when participants have been selected based on extreme score on same measure. When measured again, scores will tend to be closer to the average in the population. Thus, if students are targeted for a special reading program based on their unusually low reading test scores, they will tend to do better on average on retesting, even if the reading program has no effect. Number 6. Selection bias. Selection bias threatens internal validity because subjects may differ initially in ways that affect their scores on the dependent measure. Any influence of the independent variable on scores cannot be separated from the effect of the pre-existing bias. This problem typically arises when researchers use pre-existing groups in their studies rather than assigning subjects to groups at random. For example, the effects of a program designed to improve worker job satisfaction might be evaluated by administering the program to workers at one factory, the experimental group, and then comparing the level of job satisfaction of those workers to that of workers at another factory where the program was not given, that is control group. If workers given the job satisfaction program indicate more satisfaction with their jobs, is it due to the program or to pre-existing differences between the groups? There is no way to tell. Number 7. Experimental mortality. This refers to the differential loss of participants from groups in a study. For example, imagine that some people drop out of a study because of frustration with the task. A group exposed to difficult conditions is more likely to lose its frustration-intolerant participants than one exposed to less difficult conditions. Any differences between the groups in performance may be due as much to the resulting difference in participants as to any difference in conditions. Study session summary. In this study session, you learned that confounding takes place when 2 or more variables combine in such a way that their effects cannot be separated. There are 7 sources of confounding: history, maturation, testing effect, instrumentation, statistical regression, selection bias, and experimental mortality. With this, we come to the end of study session 5. Thanks for listening.